"You're nothing but a janitor!" The socialites shrieked as they shoved Mary into the pool. Everyone laughed until a mysterious billionaire walked into the club. What he said next silenced the place forever. Before we begin today's story, tell me where you're watching from. Grab a coffee or settle onto the couch, and please don't forget to support us. Just click like, and I'll know you enjoy this type of story. Ready? Let's start. The morning began like any other for Mary. By 5 o'clock, she was already up, preparing breakfast for Sophia, her 12-year-old daughter, before heading off for another day of work at the elite yacht club. While the girls still slept, she organized her school uniform, left lunch money on the table, and kissed her daughter's forehead with the tenderness of someone who knows every moment counts. The bus ride to the club took 40 minutes, time she used to mentally review the day's tasks, cleaning the marble bathrooms, vacuuming the Persian rugs, polishing the crystal glasses that cost more than her monthly salary. It was a job that demanded complete discretion. The club members preferred the cleaning staff to be invisible, present just enough to keep everything impeccable. Upon arriving at the club, she greeted her colleagues with a discreet nod. Ms. Carmen, the head of housekeeping, distributed the day's tasks with her usual efficiency. "Mary, today you'll take care of the pool area and the main ballroom. There's an event tonight, so everything needs to be perfect," Ms. Carmen said, handing her the keys to the supply closets. "Yes, Ms. Carmen." "What kind of event?" Mary asked, pulling her hair into a bun. "A high society charity gala. The usual crowd, the Millers, the Smiths, that whole bunch. You know how demanding they are." Mary knew those names well. They were the club's most influential members, people who moved millions in business, while she struggled to pay the rent for her small two-room apartment. There was no resentment in her heart, just a clear awareness of the reality she lived in. Throughout the morning, she worked with her usual dedication. Every tile in the pool was meticulously cleaned, every lounge chair arranged in its exact position. The main ballroom received special treatment. The mahogany tables were waxed until they gleamed, the crystal chandeliers cleaned piece by piece, the marble floor polished until it reflected like a mirror. Around noon, some members began to arrive for lunch. Mary further minimized her presence, moving silently between tasks. It was a delicate dance she had perfected over her 3 years working there. To be present without bothering, to be efficient without being noticed. "Excuse me," a feminine voice said behind her. Mary turned and found Eleanor Miller, one of the club's most well-known socialites. Blonde, elegant, always wearing clothes that cost more than Mary's annual salary. "Yes, ma'am," she replied politely. "Could you please clean that table again? I think there are still smudges." Mary looked at the table she had just meticulously cleaned. There wasn't a smudge anywhere, but she nodded with a professional smile. "Certainly, Ms. Miller. I'll take care of it right away." As she wiped the spotless table again, she heard Eleanor comment to her friends, "It's so hard to find qualified staff these days. You have to stay on top of them all the time." The words didn't affect her. She had learned long ago to filter out such comments. Her dignity didn't depend on the approval of those people, but on the quality of her work and the love she dedicated to her daughter. The afternoon passed quickly amidst preparations for the event. Tables were set with white linen tablecloths, elaborate floral arrangements, and the club's finest china. The ballroom transformed into an elegant setting, worthy of the celebrities and entrepreneurs who would attend the gala. At 6 o'clock, Mary was finishing the last details when Ms. Carmen approached. "Can you stay late today? They'll need support during the event. It's over time." Mary thought of her daughter, who was at the neighbor's house, and the extra money that would make a difference in their tight budget. "Yes, Ms. Carmen. No problem." "Great. Just remember, during the event, keep a low profile. They don't like to be bothered by the staff." It was exactly what she always did. Being invisible was part of the job, and she had become a master of that art. At 7 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. Mary discreetly observed from the service kitchen as men in tuxedos and women in designer dresses filled the ballroom. The buzz of sophisticated conversations mingled with the clinking of champagne glasses and the soft sound of ambient music. Eleanor Miller arrived accompanied by her usual circle of friends. She wore a navy blue dress that surely cost a fortune, and her jewelry sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. Beside her, Patricia Smith displayed a pearl necklace that looked like it had come out of a museum, while Brenda Hayes completed the trio with a red dress that caught everyone's attention. "Darling, did you see who's on the guest list today?" Patricia asked, adjusting the pearls around her neck. "The usual suspects, I imagine," Eleanor replied, taking a glass of champagne from a waiter's tray. "Oh, but I heard some new entrepreneurs were invited. People with serious money, you know how it is." Brenda smiled maliciously. "I love meeting new people, especially when they have interesting bank accounts." The three laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed through the ballroom. Mary continued her work discreetly, collecting empty plates and ensuring everything was in order. She had learned to move like a shadow during these events, present only when necessary. The night ran its natural course. Speeches about charity were made, although everyone knew the real intention was to display status and make business contacts. Mary overheard fragments of conversations as she worked. Million-dollar deals discussed casually, expensive trips planned as if they were grocery runs, problems that were trivial to them but would represent a lifetime solution for her. Around 9 o'clock, the event was at its peak. The pool area had been opened for guests who wanted to get some fresh air or continue conversations in a more private setting. Underwater lights created a magical ambience, and a few couples walked around the clear water. Mary was assigned to keep the outdoor area clean and organized. Discreetly, she collected abandoned glasses and ashtrays, always careful not to interrupt conversations. That's when she noticed Eleanor and her friends had moved to the pool area, carrying their glasses and speaking in louder tones, a clear sign they had already had a considerable amount to drink. "Well, look who's here," Eleanor said, noticing Mary's presence. "Our favorite janitor, working even during the party." Patricia chuckled. "At least someone here knows their place, right?" Mary continued her work without responding, maintaining the professional smile she had perfected over the years. She knew that any reaction could be interpreted as disrespect, and she couldn't afford to lose her job. "You know what?" Eleanor continued, approaching. "I've always wondered what it must be like to live with so little. It must be liberating not to have real responsibilities." "Eleanor, you're being awful," Brenda laughed, though her tone showed no real disapproval. "I'm just being curious," Eleanor retorted. "I mean, look at her. Always so quiet, so insignificant. It must be a very simple life." Mary felt the blood rush to her face, but maintained her composure. She thought of Sophia, probably doing her homework at that moment, and the electricity bill due next week. She needed this job. "Excuse me, ladies," she said softly, trying to move away to continue her work. "Oh, you're not getting away that easily," Eleanor said, blocking her path. "We're having a civilized conversation here." Other guests began to notice the situation, forming a small circle around the scene. Some seemed uncomfortable, but no one intervened. It was as if they were watching a spectacle, the elite amusing themselves at the expense of someone from the working class. "Eleanor, perhaps it's best to—" one of the men present began to say, but he was interrupted. "Best what? She needs to learn to mingle with real people. Don't you think, dear?" Eleanor's words echoed through the pool area, creating an awkward silence among those present. Mary felt all eyes on her, but maintained her dignity intact, even in the face of public humiliation. The circle of curious onlookers around the scene grew larger with each passing second, Mary could feel the weight of all eyes, but her expression remained serene. Years of work had taught her to maintain composure even in the most embarrassing situations. "You know what I find fascinating?" Eleanor continued, her voice growing louder under the influence of champagne. "It's how some people are born to serve and others to be served. It's almost natural, don't you think?" Patricia laughed nervously. "Eleanor, I think you've had enough to drink." "Nonsense, I'm just being philosophical. Look at her, always so quiet, always obedient. It's almost as if she was made for this." Mary took a deep breath. She could feel her patience being tested, but she thought again of Sophia. Her daughter was studying for a math test, dreaming of becoming an engineer one day. Every dollar from that salary mattered to keep that dream alive. "Excuse me, but I need to finish my work," Mary said, trying to move away again. "Work?" Eleanor laughed loudly. "You call that work? Wiping a cloth here and there? Please, even my little dog does more than that." The comment provoked chuckles from some of those present, though others seemed visibly uncomfortable with the situation. A murmur of approval and disapproval ran through the group. "Eleanor, this has gone too far," Charles Hayes, Brenda's husband, said, trying to intervene. "Too far. I've barely started," Eleanor retorted, spinning dramatically. "You know what? I've always wondered if people like her truly understand class differences. Maybe it's time for a practical demonstration." Mary felt a shiver run down her spine. Eleanor's tone had shifted from mockery to something more dangerous. The other guests seemed divided between morbid curiosity and obvious embarrassment at the situation. "What do you mean by that?" Patricia asked, though her expression suggested she knew exactly what her friend was planning. "Well, she works cleaning the pool, right? How about we give her an opportunity to experience the job from a different perspective?" Mary's blood ran cold. She could see where this was going and took a step back, but the circle of people around her had closed in. There was no easy escape. "Eleanor, don't be ridiculous," a male voice from the group said, but the tone wasn't one of true disapproval. "Ridiculous? I'm being educational. She's probably never experienced the refreshing side of her job." Before Mary could react, Eleanor quickly approached. What happened next was too fast for anyone to effectively intervene. With a sudden, strong shove, Eleanor unbalanced Mary, who tried to grab onto something to prevent falling, but it was in vain. The splash of her body hitting the water echoed through the pool area like thunder. Mary emerged a few seconds later, completely soaked, her uniform clinging to her body and her hair covering part of her face. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, as if on cue, some people began to laugh. First, there were muffled giggles, then open guffaws. Eleanor led the chorus of laughter, leaning on Patricia to keep from falling over. "Now she really knows what work is!" Eleanor shouted between laughs. "Maybe she needs to clean the pool from the inside too." Mary swam to the edge of the pool, where some people moved away as if she were contagious. No one offered to help her out of the water. No one extended a hand. She climbed out alone, dripping chlorinated water onto the marble floor she had polished so carefully just hours before. The laughter continued. Some guests had pulled out their cell phones to film the scene, as if it were a spectacle worth sharing. Mary stood her ground, despite the humiliation, her dignity intact, even in the face of gratuitous cruelty. "That was amazing," Brenda said, clapping her hands. "Eleanor, you're terrible, but that was hilarious." "Someone should get her a towel," a voice from the group murmured, but no one moved. Mary looked around at all those faces watching her as if she were an animal in a zoo. People she had discreetly served for years, who had benefited from her silent and dedicated work, now saw her as entertainment. It was in that moment of tense silence, with Mary still dripping wet and the echo of laughter still lingering in the air, that the sound of firm footsteps approached from the main entrance of the club. The approaching footsteps had a different rhythm, determined, confident, but unhurried. The sound echoed through the club's marble corridor, creating a presence that seemed to fill the space even before the person appeared. The laughter from the pool area began to gradually subside, as if everyone instinctively knew that something was changing. Mary was still standing at the edge of the pool, water dripping from her soaked uniform. When the figure appeared in the glass doorway leading to the outdoor area, he was a tall man with well-groomed grey hair and an elegant bearing. He wore an impeccable suit, but without unnecessary ostentation. There was something in his presence that commanded immediate respect. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm, but with a natural authority that made everyone turn in his direction. Eleanor, who was still laughing at the situation, stopped abruptly. Her face changed expression when she recognized the newcomer, though she couldn't fully place him. There was something familiar in those dark eyes and the way he observed the scene. "Excuse the interruption," the man continued, walking slowly toward the group. "I was looking for the event organizer. I arrived a little late." Charles Hayes stepped forward, trying to regain his composure. "Of course, sir." "Edward Henderson," he replied simply, extending his hand. "I believe my invitation came at the last minute." The name provoked a murmur of recognition among some of those present. Edward Henderson was a legend in the business world, an entrepreneur who had built an empire from nothing, known for his discretion and for rarely appearing at social events. "Mr. Henderson?" Charles exclaimed, visibly nervous. "It's an honor to have you here. We didn't know you would confirm your presence." "I decided to come at the last minute," Edward said, his eyes scanning the group and stopping on Mary, who remained motionless, still drenched. "I hope I haven't missed anything important." Eleanor tried to regain control of the situation. "Oh, you haven't missed anything relevant. Just a small, accident with the service staff." "Accident?" Edward repeated, his tone remaining neutral, but his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "What kind of accident?" "Well..." Eleanor hesitated, realizing that it might not be prudent to explain exactly what had happened to one of the most powerful men in the country. The employee slipped and fell into the pool, very clumsy actually. Edward walked a few more steps toward Mary, who looked up to meet his gaze. For a moment, something passed between them, a silent recognition that no one else noticed. "Slipped?" Edward asked, still looking at Mary. "How strange. Was the floor wet?" "No." "Well," Eleanor stammered, realizing she was being questioned in a way she hadn't expected. "Perhaps we should get the lady a towel," Edward said, addressing Mary directly. "It must be uncomfortable to be so wet." Patricia quickly stepped forward. "Of course, I'll get a towel immediately." It was obvious she wanted to please the influential businessman. "Thank you," Edward said. "It's important to treat the people who make this place run well, don't you think?" The comment sounded casual, but there was an implicit criticism that did not go unnoticed by anyone. The embarrassment was palpable in the air. "Absolutely," Charles agreed, though his voice sounded forced. "We always prioritize the well-being of all our staff." "Good to know," Edward replied. "In my experience, how we treat the people who work for us says a lot about our character." Eleanor tried to change the subject. "Mr. Henderson, what a pleasure to meet you personally. I'm sure everyone here would love to discuss business. There are so many opportunities." "Indeed," Edward interrupted softly. "But first, I'd like to have a word with the club management. It seems there are some protocol issues that need to be clarified." His tone was polite, but there was a firmness that made everyone understand it was not a request, but a declaration of intent. Mary remained silent, observing the interaction with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Patricia returned with a large, soft towel, offering it hesitantly to Mary. "Here you go." "Thank you," Mary murmured, accepting the towel and beginning to dry herself. Edward watched the scene carefully, as if memorizing every detail and every face present at that moment. As Mary dried herself with the towel, Edward continued to observe the group with an intensity that made everyone visibly uncomfortable. There was something in his gaze that suggested far more knowledge about the situation than he had initially shown. "You know," Edward said, breaking the tense silence, "I'm always impressed by the social dynamics of these events. It's fascinating to observe how people behave when they believe no one important is watching." Eleanor forced a smile. "What do you mean, Mr. Henderson?" "Well, you were all having fun before I arrived. You seemed very animated about something." His eyes turned back to Mary. "Perhaps you could tell me what was so amusing." The group's embarrassment was evident. Several guests began to discreetly step away, as if wanting to dissociate themselves from what had happened. Only Eleanor's closest circle remained, trapped in the situation. "It was just... well, you know how these parties are," Brenda murmured. "Sometimes things get a little too lively." "Lively," Edward repeated, savoring the word. "It's an interesting way to describe what I saw when I got here." Mary finished drying herself and carefully folded the towel. She was about to discreetly withdraw when Edward addressed her directly. "Excuse me, but we haven't properly introduced ourselves. What is your name?" The question caught everyone by surprise. It was unusual for high-level guests to address staff directly, especially at formal events. "Mary Jones, sir," she replied, maintaining a respectful tone. "Mary," Edward repeated, as if testing the name. "And how long have you worked here at the club?" 3 years, sir." 3 years. Long enough to know this place well and the people who frequent it," Eleanor quickly interjected. "Mr. Henderson, I'm sure there are much more interesting people to talk to than the employee?" Edward finished, his tone remaining polite, but with a coolness that made Eleanor recoil. "Actually, I think the people who work in a place can tell us a lot about its true nature." He turned back to Mary. "Tell me, Mary, do you like working here?" The question was loaded with implications. Mary knew any answer could have consequences, but there was something in Edward's eyes that encouraged her to be honest. "It's honest work, sir. I support my daughter with what I earn here." "Daughter?" Edward repeated, nodding. "How old is she?" 12. She's in middle school. And what does she want to be when she grows up?" The question surprised Mary. No one had ever shown real interest in her personal life like that. She wants to be an engineer." A genuine smile appeared on Edward's face for the first time since he arrived. "An engineer, an admirable profession. I'm sure she'll get there." "We hope so, sir." Eleanor was becoming visibly irritated by the attention Edward was giving Mary. "Mr. Henderson, perhaps we could go to the main ballroom. There are several important people who would very much like to meet you." "Important," Edward murmured. "It's interesting how we define importance, isn't it?" He looked around the group. "For example, who here would consider a single mother who works to support her daughter an important person?" The silence that followed was awkward. No one knew how to answer a question that seemed like a philosophical trick. "I do," Edward continued. "In fact, I consider it far more important than someone who has never worked a day in their life but inherited everything from family." The comment was like a silent bomb. Several of those present came from exactly that background, and everyone knew it. Charles tried to change the subject. "Mr. Henderson, I believe there's a misunderstanding here. We all highly respect our employees." "Respect?" Edward interrupted. "Interesting. And how exactly do you demonstrate that respect?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Edward turned to Mary once more. "Mary, I'd like to ask a personal question, if I may. When you were a child, where did you live?" The question seemed random to everyone except Mary, who felt something familiar in Edward's tone, though she couldn't identify what it was. "In the St. John's neighborhood, sir. In a small house with my grandmother." Edward nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he already knew. St. John's, Edward repeated, and this time there was something different in his voice, a softness that hadn't been there before. A working-class neighborhood. I know the area well. Mary observed him more closely. There was something familiar about his face, but she couldn't identify what it was. Perhaps it was just the feeling of talking to someone who genuinely listened to her, unlike the treatment she usually received. "Is your grandmother still alive?" Edward asked. "No, sir. She passed away when I was 16. "I'm sorry," Edward said, and the sincerity in his voice was undeniable. "I'm sure she would be proud of the woman you've become and the way you're raising your daughter." The words touched Mary in an unexpected way. Tears threatened to well up in her eyes, but she controlled herself. It was not the place or time to show emotion. Eleanor, who had watched the entire interaction with growing irritation, decided to intervene again. "With all due respect, Mr. Henderson, I think we're wasting time on irrelevant matters. There's important business to be discussed." Edward slowly turned to Eleanor, and for the first time since he arrived, his expression visibly hardened. "Irrelevant," he repeated, his voice low but laden with an authority that made everyone instinctively recoil. "Ms. Eleanor Miller," she replied, trying to maintain her haughtiness, though her voice trembled slightly. "Ms. Miller, I'd like to clarify something. In all my career in business, I've learned that nothing is more important than the character of the people we choose to associate with. And character is revealed not in how we treat our superiors, but in how we treat those we consider inferior." The group was in absolute silence now. The tension in the air was almost palpable. "When I arrived here," Edward continued, "I saw a hard-working woman being humiliated and assaulted by a group of people who consider themselves superior. I saw cruel laughter and a complete lack of basic empathy. That tells me a lot about the character of the people involved." Patricia tried to defend herself. "Mr. Henderson, there was a misunderstanding. It wasn't quite like that." "It wasn't?" Edward interrupted. "Then explain to me, how exactly does a person slip and fall into a pool while an entire group laughs at the situation? And why did no one offer immediate help?" No one had an answer. The excuses died on their lips before they were even uttered. Edward walked a few steps toward the pool, observing the clear water under the underwater lights. "You know, I built my company on some fundamental principles. One of them is to treat all people with dignity, regardless of their social or economic position." He turned back to the group. "Another principle is never to do business with people who demonstrate a lack of basic character." The implications of what he was saying began to become clear to all present. Several of the families there had business connections or aspired to have commercial relationships with companies in Edward's group. "Mr. Henderson," Charles began, visibly nervous, "I'm sure we can resolve any misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Hayes," Edward cut in. "I saw exactly what I needed to see." Mary watched the entire scene with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. She had never witnessed anyone defending a person of her social standing in that way, especially not someone as powerful as Edward appeared to be. "Mary," Edward said, addressing her again, "may I ask you one more personal question?" "Yes, sir." "What is your daughter's name?" "Sophia, sir." Edward smiled again, that genuine smile that completely transformed his expression. "Sophia, a beautiful name. It means wisdom." "Yes, sir. My grandmother chose the name." "Your grandmother had good taste," Edward said. Then, after a pause, he added, "And what is her full last name?" "Sophia Jones Henderson." The name came naturally from Mary's lips, but the moment it was uttered, the silence that followed was different from all the others. It was a silence charged with shock and gradual comprehension. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing a profound emotion. The name echoed in the air like silent thunder. Sophia Jones Henderson. Edward stood motionless for a few seconds, processing what he had just heard. When he opened his eyes, there were tears in them. Mary watched him with growing confusion. "Sir, are you all right?" "Henderson," Edward repeated softly, more to himself than to the others. "Your daughter. Her last name is Henderson." "Yes, sir, it's her father's last name." The revelation hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He took a few faltering steps, discreetly leaning on one of the chairs near the pool. Eleanor and her friends watched the scene without fully understanding what was happening, but realizing that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic of the situation. "Mary," Edward said, his voice trembling, "Sophia's father, what was his name?" "Richard Henderson," Mary replied, still not understanding why that information was so important. "But he left us when he found out I was pregnant. We never saw him again." Edward closed his eyes again, this time for longer. When he opened them, his face was transfigured by a mixture of pain, regret, and something that looked like hope. "Richard," he murmured, "my son." The words were spoken softly, but the silence in the pool area was so absolute that everyone heard. Mary felt her legs weaken. Your son?" she stammered. Edward nodded slowly. "Richard Henderson is my son, my only son." He looked directly into Mary's eyes, which means Sophia is my granddaughter. Mary's world seemed to stop. All the pieces began to fall into place. The familiarity she had felt, the way Edward had asked about her life, the genuine interest he had shown. She gripped the edge of the pool to keep from falling. "That's impossible," she whispered. "It's not impossible," Edward said, approaching her carefully. "I've spent 12 years looking for both of you." Eleanor and the others watched the scene like spectators at a surreal play. The woman they had humiliated moments before had just been revealed as the granddaughter of the richest and most powerful man present at the event. "Looking for us?" Mary repeated, her voice almost inaudible. "When Richard left home, we had a terrible fight. He said he was going to live his life away from me, away from the family money. I was furious, too proud to go after him." Edward stopped in front of Mary, maintaining a respectful distance. "I only found out he had met someone special much later. When I finally tried to find him, he had disappeared. I hired detectives, investigated for years, but I could never locate them." "He died," Mary said softly. "A car accident 3 years after Sophia was born." The pain that crossed Edward's face was visible to everyone. He leaned heavily on the nearest chair. "My God," he murmured. "I lost my son and didn't even know I had a granddaughter." "Mr. Edward," Mary said hesitantly, I didn't know Richard had family. He never spoke about you. He said he was alone in the world." "That was my fault," Edward admitted. "I was a terrible father, too strict, too focused on business. Richard wanted freedom. He wanted to be loved for who he was, not for the family money. And I didn't know how to give that to him." Patricia, who had remained in shocked silence, finally found her voice. "Mr. Henderson, then Mary is—" "My granddaughter's mother," Edward completed. "The woman you just humiliated and assaulted is the mother of the only family I have left in this world." The realization of what they had done began to hit everyone present with full force. Eleanor was as pale as the moon, understanding the implications of her actions. I didn't know," she stammered. "Didn't know?" Edward repeated, his voice gaining a cutting coldness. "And does that justify treating anyone the way you treated Mary? Does the fact that you didn't know who she was make the humiliation acceptable?" No one answered because there was no possible answer. Edward turned to Mary again. "Please forgive me. If I had arrived a few minutes earlier—" "Mr. Edward," Mary interrupted, "you have nothing to apologize for. It wasn't your fault." But it should have been me protecting you. I should have found you years ago. Tears streamed freely down the businessman's face now, and Mary felt her heart ache for the man who had lost so much time with his family. "Mary," Edward said, discreetly wiping his tears, "tell me about Sophia. What's she like? How has it been raising her alone?" Despite the shock of the revelation, Mary felt a familiar warmth as she spoke of her daughter. She's incredible, Mr. Edward. Smart, determined. She gets excellent grades in school, helps at home, never complains about the difficulties we face." "Does she look like Richard?" "A little. She has his eyes, the same stubbornness." Mary smiled for the first time since she arrived at the pool area. "But she's much more sensible than her father was." Edward chuckled softly, a sound filled with longing. "Richard was always stubborn. Even as a child, when he made up his mind about something, there was no force in the world that could make him change it. Sophia is the same. When she decides she's going to achieve something, she doesn't give up until she succeeds. And she really wants to be an engineer. Since she was little, she loves math, spends hours solving problems even I don't understand. Sometimes I worry it might be too difficult, that our situation won't allow it." "Our situation will change," Edward interrupted gently, "if you allow it, of course." Mary looked at him cautiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you are my family. The only family I have left. I want to meet my granddaughter. I want to be a part of your lives, if you'll let me." Eleanor, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, tried one last desperate move. "Mr. Henderson, I'm sure there are legal matters to be resolved, DNA tests." Edward turned to her with an expression that could freeze fire. "Ms. Miller, I suggest you worry about your own problems. And believe me, after what I witnessed today, you'll have plenty." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, though her voice betrayed the fear she tried to hide. "What do I mean?" Edward repeated. "Well, let me explain. Your husband's company has multi-million-dollar contracts with 3 of my subsidiaries, contracts that will be reviewed next week." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. "Furthermore," Edward continued, "your son works in the legal department of one of our partner companies. I imagine he has aspirations for career growth." "Mr. Henderson, please," Eleanor began to plead. "And as for you, Miss Smith," Edward turned to Patricia, "your investment club needs approval for some real estate projects, doesn't it? Projects that depend on licenses that pass through agencies where I have some influence." Patricia was visibly trembling now. "And Mr. Hayes," Edward looked at Charles, "your law firm represents several of my companies, a relationship I have always valued, until today." "Mr. Henderson," Charles began desperately, "we can forget what happened here. It was a misunderstanding. We can." "Forget?" Edward interrupted. "Oh no, I will never forget, just as I'm sure Mary will never forget being humiliated and assaulted by you." Mary watched the entire scene with a mixture of astonishment and apprehension. "Mr. Edward," she said softly, "perhaps it's not necessary." "Not necessary?" Edward turned to her. "Mary, these people treated you like dirt. They laughed at your humiliation. None of them offered help when they saw you wet and embarrassed." "I know, but there's no but that justifies it," Edward cut in. "There are consequences for our actions. There always are." He turned back to the group, who now looked like a collection of statues petrified by fear. "You had a unique opportunity today," Edward said. "You had the chance to demonstrate basic character, simple humanity. Instead, you chose gratuitous cruelty. Now you will live with the consequences of that choice." "Please," Eleanor begged, "we have families, responsibilities." "Mary also has family," Edward retorted coldly. "A 12-year-old daughter to support. That didn't stop you from humiliating her." Edward approached Mary again. "Come, let's get out of here. I have a car waiting. I want to meet my granddaughter." "But my job, my uniform is wet." Mary hesitated. "You'll never have to worry about that again," Edward said gently. "Our conversation about the future can wait, but right now I just want to meet Sophia." Mary nodded, still processing everything that had happened. As they headed for the exit, Edward stopped one last time. "Oh, and you all," he said to the paralyzed group, "you can explain to the club management that tonight's event ended early." The drive to Mary's house was mostly silent. Edward had insisted she sit in the front seat of the luxurious Mercedes-Benz, treating her with a delicacy that completely contrasted with the treatment she had received at the club. The driver, discreet and professional, navigated smoothly through the city streets. "Mary," Edward finally said, "I know all of this must be very confusing for you." It's like a dream," she admitted. "A few hours ago I was cleaning the club and now you've discovered you have a family you never knew existed," Edward completed. "I understand the shock. It's surreal for me too." Mary looked out the window, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood approach. "Mr. Edward, I need you to understand something. Sophia and we're doing fine. We're not rich, but we're happy. She's a simple girl, studious, but simple." "And that's wonderful," Edward replied sincerely. "What more could I want from a granddaughter? I'm not here to change who you are, Mary. I'm here because I lost 12 years of her life, and I don't want to lose another day." "What if she doesn't want to meet you? What if she's scared?" Edward considered the question carefully. "Then I'll wait. I'll earn her trust the right way, in her own time. I won't force anything." They arrived at a modest street where small houses lined up side by side. Mary pointed to a yellow house with a small porch. "It's here." Edward observed the simple but well-kept house. There were potted plants on the porch and a pink bicycle leaning against the wall, evidently Sophia's. "It's a home," he said simply. "I can feel the love from here." They got out of the car, and Mary led Edward to the door. Her hands trembled slightly as she searched for keys in her purse. "Miss Mary," a voice called from the house next door, "you're home early today." An elderly lady appeared at the window, the neighbor who watched Sophia when Mary worked late. "Hi, Miss Carmen. Is Sophia there?" "She is, doing math homework at the kitchen table. That girl is a genius. Do you want me to call her?" "No need. Thank you. I'll get her." Edward accompanied Mary to the door, clearly nervous. "How do I introduce myself? What do I say?" "The truth," Mary replied simply. "Sophia is smart. She'll understand." They entered the small but cozy house. The living room was modest, but every object had its place, and everything was impeccably clean. Photos of Sophia at different ages adorned the walls, showing her growth over the years. "Mom, you're home early." A young voice came from the kitchen. "Yes, honey. Can you come out to the living room? I have someone I want you to meet." Light footsteps approached, and then Sophia appeared at the living room entrance. Edward felt the air leave his lungs. The girl was almost a miniature copy of Richard at the same age. The same intelligent dark eyes, the same curious expression, the same unruly hair that never quite stayed in place. "Sophia," Mary said softly, "this is Mr. Edward Henderson." The girl greeted him politely as she had been taught. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening, Sophia," Edward replied, his voice slightly choked. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Sophia looked curiously between her mother and the elegant visitor. "Henderson, like my last name." "That's right," Mary said, taking a deep breath. "Sophia, Mr. Edward he's your father's father." The girl blinked a few times, processing the information. "My grandpa." "Your grandpa," Edward confirmed, kneeling to be at her eye level. "I've been looking for you and your mother for a long time." Sophia studied him with the seriousness that only intelligent children possess. "Why did my father never talk about you?" The question was direct, without beating around the bush. Edward appreciated her honesty. Because your father and I had a falling out before you were born, it was my fault. I wasn't a good father to him. And now you want to be a good grandpa to me? The simplicity of the question touched Edward deeply. Yes, Sophia, if you let me, I would very much like to be your grandpa. Sophia looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. Then, with the quick decision typical of children, she extended her small hand to Edward. Okay, but you need to know that I'm very good at math, and I'm going to be an engineer when I grow up. Edward squeezed his granddaughter's delicate hand, feeling tears stream freely down his face. I'm sure you'll be the best engineer in the world. 6 months later, Mary and Sophia's lives had changed completely, but not in the way many might have expected. Edward had been careful to respect their autonomy, building the relationship gradually and always respecting Mary's decisions on how to manage the transition. Sophia continued studying at the same school, by her own choice, as she loved her teachers and classmates. But now she had private English and computer lessons, as well as an educational fund that would guarantee her entry into the country's best engineering university. Mary had left her job at the club, but not to settle down. With Edward's support, she had returned to her studies, pursuing a degree in administration to help manage some of the social initiatives Edward had begun to develop. The work gave her purpose and independence, qualities Edward deeply admired. That Saturday morning, the three of them were in the garden of the new house, still in the same neighborhood at Mary's insistence, but now a larger house with space for Sophia to study and play. Edward watched his granddaughter explain a science project she was developing for the school science fair. "Grandpa, look," Sophia said excitedly, showing off a bridge model. "If I calculate the tension exactly here and distribute the weight like this, it can hold much more weight." "Impressive," Edward replied genuinely. "You were truly born for this." "Mom always said I could be anything I wanted," Sophia said, looking affectionately at Mary. "Now I have more help to achieve it, but I always knew I could." Mary smiled, proud of her daughter's maturity. Gradually, Sophia had accepted Edward as part of the family, but always keeping it clear that Mary remained her primary reference. "Speaking of help," Edward said, "I received some interesting news yesterday." "What news?" Mary asked. "Remember the people from the club that night?" Mary nodded. How could she forget? Well, Eleanor Miller had to sell her beach house to cover her husband's business losses. Patricia Smith saw her real estate investments denied and is facing serious financial problems. And Charles Hayes lost several important clients and had to drastically reduce his firm. Sophia, who knew the full story of what had happened that night, looked thoughtful. "Grandpa, do you think they learned anything?" The question surprised Edward. "Why do you ask that, dear?" "Because Mom always taught me that what's important isn't revenge, but the lesson. If they only lost money but didn't learn to treat people better, then it didn't really help much." Edward looked at Mary, impressed by the wisdom she had imparted to her daughter. "You're right, Sophia, and you know what? I received letters from all of them. Letters. Apologizing, not just to me, but specifically to your mother. And more importantly, Eleanor Miller started volunteering at a shelter. Patricia is giving free financial literacy classes to single mothers. And Charles opened a pro bono legal aid program." Mary was surprised. Seriously. Sometimes people need to lose something important to discover what truly matters. "And what are you going to do?" Sophia asked. Edward smiled. "I'm going to give everyone a second chance, but they'll have to prove the change is real." Sophia nodded in approval. "I think that's fair. Everyone deserves a second chance." Later that night, after Sophia had gone to sleep, Mary and Edward talked on the porch of the house. The sky was starry, and the peace of the neighborhood contrasted completely with the bustling luxury of the club where they met. "Edward," Mary said, "thank you. For what? For not trying to change who we are, for respecting our lives, our values, for truly being a grandfather and not just a benefactor. Thank you, Edward replied. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, a real family. Sophia teaches me every day that true wealth isn't in a bank account, but in the people we love. And what happens now? Now we'll continue building our family one day at a time. Sophia will graduate. She'll become